In the last module, we looked at the markets for land and capital. And in the first module for this unit, we also focused on the demand for labor as a factor market. In this module, we're going to finish our look at the market for labor by looking at the supply of labor and how it acts differently than the supply for different goods and services, and also how equilibrium wages are determined in the market for labor. So in this module, I will describe how a worker's decision about time preference gives rise to labor supply. And then we will determine the equilibrium wage and level of employment in the labor market. So let's begin by thinking about the supply of labor. Okay? When people decide to supply their labor, when I decide I'm going to give a certain number of hours to work, and I'm going to work for an employer like the Douglas County School District, and I decide how many hours do I want to work? Or I decide a career, and I say, how many hours do I have to work in that career? Or you decide how many hours you want to work at the job you're going to do. You're making a decision about how much labor you are going to supply at a given wage. And decisions about labor supply are different than decisions about supply of goods and services that firms provide to us in the product market. Because these are decisions about how we allocate our time and how many hours we spend on different activities. You can spend a certain number of hours providing your labor and working, but what you give up when you do that is leisure time. Now, leisure time doesn't just mean goofing off. Leisure time means time spent not working, doing other things. Time with friends, time going to the movies, time working out, time spent reading, time relaxing, time sleeping, whatever it might be. Any of those things that you're doing when you're not working is leisure time. And so you can choose, you have a limited number of hours in every day, and as people and human beings, we choose how to spend our time. Do we want to spend our time working, or do we want to spend our time in leisure? And so we have to decide how many hours to give to each activity. And leisure is time available for purposes other than earning money to buy marketed goods. Now, those goods give us pleasure. When you work and you earn money, you can buy goods and services. And those goods and services give you a certain amount of utility or pleasure. And we discussed that in Unit 3, when we look at how consumers maximize their utility on how much of a quantity of a good or service to produce. And we said that is where the marginal benefit of that good equals the marginal cost of that good. And then we stop consuming it. Well, here we have to look at leisure and how much value that gives us. Yes, buying goods and services gives us value and gives us utility and satisfaction. But leisure can be looked at as a normal good as well, because leisure time also gives us utility and satisfaction. So we can use our time to earn money to buy marketed goods and services that give us value and satisfaction and happiness, or we can use our time for leisure that gives us satisfaction and happiness. So households demand many things. We demand gasoline, milk, Nintendo gaming systems from the firms that supply them. And if the consumers are willing and able to pay the going price, then the item is sold. These are product markets, and we've discussed them throughout our course in microeconomics. But now we have to switch our perspective to the factor markets, and the labor market is going to be our focus here. Households supply labor to the firms that need it or demand it. And the price for this transaction is the going wage. So our first task is to determine what makes a person willing to supply hours of labor to their employers. Now, here we think about the trade-off between work and leisure. And so economists view a person's choice to work as, no surprise, a cost-benefit decision. When you decide how many hours to work, you look at, well, if I work, what am I giving up? That's the cost in terms of leisure. But what's the benefit I get in return from the money I earn and what I can buy with it? And so you do that cost-benefit analysis. So you look at the benefit of 1 hour of work. That's a wage or money that you earn to consume goods and services that provide you with utility and satisfaction. The cost of 1 hour of work is the utility or happiness or satisfaction you could get from leisure activities. So the price of leisure is the wage a person gives up. So the decision is simple. You always are deciding, am I willing to work one more hour? And you will work the next hour if you expect your wage to provide you with more marginal utility or happiness than the leisure activities you give up with that hour. Likewise, you will not work the next hour if you expect your wage and what you can buy with it to provide you with less marginal utility and happiness than the leisure activities you give up. So equilibrium occurs, or the number of hours that you give to work and leisure occurs where the marginal utility of the next hour of work is equal to the marginal utility of the next hour of leisure. That shouldn't be a surprise. So when we think about wages and labor supply, a rise in the wage rate, all other things being equal, causes both an income and a substitution effect on an individual's labor supply. Depending upon the type of work, there is a wage below which a person will not work any hours. This is called the reservation wage. So if the Douglas County School District were to tell me, they were only going to pay me $3 an hour for my work, I wouldn't work for them at all. I would give them 0 hours of labor. Now, I'm just coming up with that as a hypothetical example, but there is a certain dollar amount per hour that is a dollar amount that below that dollar amount, below that wage, you will work 0 hours. And whatever that number is, that's your reservation wage. That's the minimum wage someone has to pay you to work any hours of work. Okay. Now, so a person must receive more than his or her reservation wage before that person supplies any hours to the labor market. But usually, once you get above that wage and you're willing to supply some hours of labor, as the wage rises, the person decides that working more hours so they can consume more goods and services will increase their utility, and so they choose fewer hours of leisure and more hours of work. And that will result in an upward sloping labor supply curve. As the wage rises, more quantity of hours will be supplied to work. But the higher wage also gives this person more income at all levels of work. So maybe this person will choose to work fewer hours at a higher wage and have more leisure hours. Why? Because we can think of leisure as a normal good. And we know with normal goods, when income rises, we consume more normal goods. So if leisure is a normal good, as our wage rises, we may consume more of it. So we have one of two choices. The wage goes up, and maybe we will supply more hours of work. So this is what we mean by two things, the substitution effect and the leisure effect, or the income effect of a higher wage. When wages rise, there are two things affecting a person's decision to work more or fewer hours. The first one is the substitution effect that will cause you to work more hours when the wage goes up. Why? Because a higher wage increases the opportunity cost or price of leisure. When the wage goes up, if you choose more leisure hours, you're giving up more money in wages. So as the price of leisure goes up, you will consume fewer hours of leisure and more hours of work because of the substitution effect at that higher wage. So the person will substitute fewer hours of leisure for more hours of work. But there is also a competing influence called the income effect. A higher wage increases a person's income no matter how many hours of work you choose. Because every hour you work, you're earning a higher wage for that hour. So at higher levels of income, a person may consume more hours of leisure activities because leisure is a normal good. And this reduces hours of work. So the substitution effect says when your wages go up, you'll work more hours of work. But the income effect says when the wage goes up, you'll work fewer hours of work. So what is it? The wage goes up and one says you'll work more hours, the other says you work fewer hours. Well, it depends on which effect is greater. If the substitution effect is greater, then you will work more hours of work at a higher wage. But if this income effect is greater, you will work fewer hours at a higher wage. So as the wage rises, the substitution effect says work more. while the income effect says work less. If the individual's labor supply curve is upward sloping, then it must be the case that the substitution effect is stronger than the income effect, leading to more hours worked. But if the income effect is stronger, particularly at very high wages, the labor supply curve is downward sloping, or what we call backward bending, so that you work fewer hours at a higher wage. So in the following graph, the individual labor supply curve shows how the quantity of labor supplied by an individual depends on that individual's wage rate. So as I said, in panel A, when the substitution effect dominates, we get an upward sloping supply curve for labor. When the wage goes up, the quantity of hours supplied to labor increases. In this case, when the wage goes from 10 to 20, a person chooses to work 50 hours instead of 40. But if the income effect dominates, as in panel B, the labor supply curve is actually downward sloping, meaning that when the wage goes from $10 to $20, instead of working 40 hours, you work 30 hours. So what this leads to is a labor supply curve that tends to look like this, what we call a backward bending supply curve at very high wages. When people are working at jobs where their wages are lower, the substitution effect tends to be greater than the income effect, and an increase in wages will cause people to work more hours. But when people are paid much higher wages, as you see here, the labor supply curve is backward bending and downward sloping, meaning people will choose to work fewer hours and consume more leisure at higher wages. So we usually assume that for most people, the labor supply curve does slope upward. It's only when you're paid very high wages that it may be sloping downward. And if you think about that, in recent times, this has actually happened, right? Because think about what's happened in recent times in American history. If you go back to the 19th century, people were working pretty much 6 days a week, 70 hours a week, and they devoted very little time to leisure. But most people were paid very little money then. But incomes have risen significantly in the 20th and 21st centuries. Most people don't work 70 hours a week anymore. They work a typical 40-hour work week, so they work fewer hours. People don't work for their entire lives. They retire at the age of 65 now, typically. And so people are choosing to consume more labor. Why? Because incomes tend to be higher now than they used to be. Now, just like we can have shifts in the demand curve for labor, we can have shifts of the labor supply curve. Now, everyone has their own individual labor supply curve, determining how much labor they will supply at different wages. But if you sum up all those individual labor supply curves, then we get the market supply curve for labor, and that's the horizontal sum of the individual supply curves of all workers in that market. And that market labor supply curve can shift for four main reasons. First, there can be changes in preferences and social norms that provide more labor in the market at all wages. For example, if there are changes in preferences and social norms. For example, after World War II in the United States, the participation of women in the workplace greatly increased. Prior to that time, it was expected that women would stay home, raise their children, take care of their husbands, cook and clean, and not work in a career. But those social norms changed after World War II. More women went to college and got college degrees. More women pursued different careers and entered the labor market, thus increasing the supply of labor. And that shifted the supply of labor to the right. There can be changes in population. We have more and more immigrants coming to this country, increasing the population of the United States. Birth rates in this country are increasing, especially amongst the Latino population, and those exceed death rates. So our population in the United States is increasing, and that provides more workers. That increases the labor force and the supply of labor, and so that will slowly shift the labor supply curve to the right. There can also be changes in opportunities for workers. We have seen opportunities in some labor markets grow, while opportunities in others have diminished. As demand for healthcare has increased and the population has aged, jobs in health services such as nursing or pharmaceuticals have become more highly demanded. And so that has increased the supply of nurses and pharmacists. When more students graduate from college with nursing degrees, collectively they shift the supply of labor to the right in the nursing labor market. But the opposite has happened in manufacturing industries. Because manufactured goods in the United States have been faced with difficult international competition, many factories in the steel industry, the auto industry, and other industries have shut down and closed and moved their operations to other countries, and older workers have been offered early retirement. Gradually, this has resulted in a decreased supply of manufacturing labor. There can also be changes in wealth. Now, wealth is not the same thing as income. Income is the money you earn. Wealth is the value of the things that you own, your assets, the value of your home, the value of your land or real estate, the value of your mutual funds, your stocks or bonds or pensions, and how much they are worth. So if the stock market is weak and stock prices go down, then your wealth goes down. If the housing market is depressed, the value of homes and real estate decline and your wealth goes down. But the value of homes and prices rises, as they have been rising significantly here in the Denver metro market, then individuals' wealth is increasing. Now, because people feel wealthier, this would shift the labor supply curve to the left. Because if individuals feel wealthier, they don't feel they have to work as much. And they'll choose to consume more leisure. But if wealth declines, then it will shift the supply of labor to the right, because individuals cannot consume as much leisure anymore, and they have to work more and earn more money. Now, in the AP exam, you may be asked to identify, graph, and analyze shifts of the labor supply curve. So make sure that you can analyze and do this and know whether you're shifting the labor supply curve to the right or to the left, for which reasons, and what that results in terms of equilibrium wages and quantity of labor supplied and demanded. Now, here's an example. We've seen a decline in summer jobs. If you go back to the early 90s, about 79% of American teenagers and young people had summer jobs. Today, only about 30% of young people, 34% of young people accept summer jobs. And why is it that so many young Americans have chosen not to take summer jobs, decreasing the supply of labor amongst young people in the summer? Well, an important factor is increasing household affluence. Many households are wealthier. And so that has resulted in many teenagers no longer feeling the pressure like they once did to contribute money to household finances. So this is the income effect, and it's led to a reduced labor supply for summer jobs. But there's another factor at work. So because households feel wealthier, that income effect leads to less supply of workers for summer jobs. But there's another factor, and that's the substitution effect. We've had increased competition from immigrants that are willing to work in many of these summer jobs. And those immigrants have driven wages down, and that has led to a decline in wages. So for these two reasons, many teenagers choose to give up summer work and consume more leisure instead. Now let's look at equilibrium in the labor market. When we combine the labor demand curves for many competitive firms and the labor supply curves for many individuals, we can model the entire labor market with simple supply and demand. Labor demand for the market is downward sloping, as firms will, all else equal, wish to employ fewer units of labor at higher wages. Labor supply for the market is upward sloping, as individuals will, all else equal, wish to offer more units of labor at higher wages. Equilibrium is, of course, at the only wage where the quantity of labor supplied is equal to the quantity of labor demanded. And the wage, which we will call W, the market wage, is equal to the value of the marginal product of the last unit of labor hired. So, the labor market, equilibrium in the labor market, in a perfectly competitive labor market, would look like this. Now, the horizontal axis can also be measured in units of hours to match an hourly wage on the vertical axis. But this is what the equilibrium market would look like, with a downward sloping labor market demand curve and an upward sloping market labor supply curve. But what if, it's not perfectly competitive? Well, we saw in earlier units that when the product market is perfectly competitive, the wage rate is equal to the value of the marginal product of labor at equilibrium. But if the market is not perfectly competitive, there is a price effect, so that the price of the output must go down to increase output sold. So to determine demand for workers in this situation, if it's not a perfectly competitive labor market, the monopolist must multiply the marginal product of labor by the marginal revenue to get the marginal revenue product of labor, or MRPL. And think about why this is true. Think about the fundamental difference between perfect competition and imperfect competition. As we saw in the product market, when we had perfect competition, there was no ability to determine the price. Perfectly competitive firms were price makers, and they had to accept the market price as their price. But a monopoly had price setting power. It had market power, and it could set a price above marginal cost and the minimum of average total cost. So this is also true when labor markets are imperfectly competitive. There's an ability to set the price of the product. So when firms have price setting ability, we saw that price must be lowered to increase the quantity sold, and this creates a situation where the price of the last unit sold is greater than the marginal revenue from selling it. Remember, for a monopoly, the marginal revenue curve was below the demand curve, because to sell one more unit, they had to lower the price on all previous units sold, and they lost that revenue as well. So under perfect competition, price is equal to marginal revenue due to price-taking behavior. But under imperfect competition, price was greater than marginal revenue due to price-setting behavior. So how does this impact the decision to hire inputs like labor? Well, recall that hiring under perfectly competitive conditions takes place up to the point where the marginal dollars of benefit collected from his or her production is equal to the marginal dollars of cost incurred from his or her employment, or where the value of the marginal product of labor is equal to the price of the good being sold times the marginal product of labor, and that is equal to the wage. Well, that was true under a perfectly competitive labor market, but the same is true under imperfect competition, except the marginal dollars of benefit received is not a function of price, but a function of marginal revenue. The marginal revenue product, or MRPL, equals the marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor, and the hiring decision is now hire where the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the wage. But since the marginal revenue is greater than the price, it must be the case that the marginal revenue product of labor is greater than the value of the marginal product of labor. So in a graph like this, both are downward sloping. But the marginal revenue product of labor will lie below the value of the marginal product of labor, just like the demand curve for the monopolist lied above the marginal revenue curve for the monopolist. Well, here, the marginal revenue product of labor is below the curve for the value of the marginal product of labor. And in an imperfectly competitive labor market, if there, say you're in a rural community where there is one dominant firm that hires all the workers, instead of being called a monopolist, that's called a monopsonist. A monopsonist means when one buyer of labor or one firm is the primary or sole buyer of labor in a community, and that gives them pricing power. Now, assuming a constant wage, we can see in this graph that fewer units of labor will be employed if firms in the product market have pricing power than if they are price takers. Now, if we go back to firms supplying labor in a perfectly competitive market, remember, for an individual firm, their labor supply curve will be horizontal and equal to the marginal factor cost of labor that is determined from the market equilibrium wage that is shown in panel B. So panel B determines the market wage, and in a perfectly competitive labor market for the individual firm, every time they hire a worker, it will be equal to the wage. So the marginal factor cost of labor will be equal to the wage, the market wage, in a perfectly competitive labor market. But when the labor market is imperfectly competitive, firms use the marginal factor cost, or the additional cost of hiring one more unit of the factor of production, to determine how much to hire. When we assumed a perfectly competitive labor market, we assumed that many small firms could employ as much labor as they wish at the prevailing wage. They were wage takers. The additional cost of hiring the next unit of labor, or marginal factor cost of labor, if we go back to the previous screen, was constant and equal to the wage. This implied that the supply of labor was a horizontal line at the market wage. But what if the assumption of many small wage-taking firms is not true? Suppose there is one very large firm in the market that hires most of the workers, like in a rural community. When this firm, that we call a monopsony, hires more and more labor, it has to hire higher and higher wages to attract them. This is because the labor supply curve is upward sloping and they face it all by themselves. Well, if they have to offer a higher wage to attract all workers, or another worker, they have to raise the wage for all the workers that they've already hired, for all units of labor. So this tells us that the marginal factor cost of labor rises as more workers are employed. And we can see here that a firm in an imperfectly competitive labor market is large enough to affect the market wage, because a monopsonist is a single buyer of a factor of labor. So look at this graph here, which tells us that the marginal factor cost of labor rises as more workers are employed. And we can see that the marginal factor cost of labor in the fourth column is greater than the wage in the second column. Now, if you have a hard time understanding why the marginal factor cost of labor lies above the wage, remember our study of monopoly. Again, I mentioned it once before, but let me mention it again because this might help you understand it. When a monopolist wants to sell an additional unit, the price must be lowered for that next unit. But it also has to be lowered for all the units that came before. So the additional revenue, the marginal revenue, is equal to the new price, minus revenue lost from earlier units that would have been sold at the higher price. Well, if this is a monopsonist hiring labor, now an employer wants to hire one more worker and must raise the wage to do so because they face the supply curve for labor all on their own. But the wage must also be increased for the workers that they've already hired that came before and who would have worked for the lower wage. So look at what happens when a third worker is hired. Yesterday, the firm employed 2 workers, and the wage from the labor supply curve was $9. But today we wish to employ 3 workers, and the labor supply curve says we have to hire that worker for $10. But we also have to pay the 2 workers that we were paying $9, $10 now. So that's an additional $2 we have to pay for that worker. So we not only pay $10 for the third worker, we have to pay an additional $2 for the previous workers. So the marginal factor cost of the third worker is $12, not $10, the wage of the third worker. So it works the same way for a monopsonist in the factor market as it did for a monopoly in the product market. So the additional costs of labor, $10 for the third worker, plus $1 more for the second worker, and $1 more for the first worker, equals $12 of additional labor costs. Thus, the marginal factor cost of labor for a monopsonist is $12, while the wage is only $10 for the third worker. So this looks different in an imperfectly competitive labor market than it does in a perfectly competitive labor market, which we had studied prior to this. And this is what the graph will look like. The labor supply curve will be below the marginal factor cost of labor curve for the very reasons we just discussed. Here you see the marginal factor cost of labor with imperfect competition in the labor market. Again, a graph that shows that the marginal factor cost of labor in the fourth column is always greater than the wage that is paid to the worker. Those two would be equal if this was a perfectly competitive labor market. The fourth column and second column would always be equal to each other. The marginal factor cost of labor would be equal to the wage under perfectly competitive labor market. But in an imperfectly competitive labor market, such as one faced by a monopsonist, the marginal factor cost of labor will always be greater than the wage. And here we see it again, with the market labor supply curve being below the marginal factor cost of labor curve in an imperfectly competitive market. So, in an imperfectly competitive labor market, how many workers should firms hire? When both the product market and the labor market are imperfectly competitive, how many units of labor will the firm employ? Well, it's the same decision as we've seen before. You hire the number of workers up to the point where the additional dollars of revenue that you earn from hiring that worker and what they produce is equal to the additional dollars of labor cost incurred from hiring that worker. So you will hire a number of units of labor where the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the marginal factor cost of labor. And that will be the hiring rule in an imperfectly competitive market. And that rule is shown here on this graph, and you should know that. But it's very similar to the way we did marginal analysis in all other types of markets. So the question is, what is the equilibrium wage? Well, we have to consult the labor supply curve at the employment level to determine that. So let's look at this graph. Here you see the market labor supply curve below the marginal factor cost of labor curve in an imperfectly competitive market, but now we add to it the marginal revenue product of labor, which is the firm's demand curve for labor. Remember, they're one and the same. Well, just like under a perfectly competitive labor market, our hiring decision will be made where the marginal factor cost of labor is equal to the marginal revenue cost of labor. But we don't pay that wage. Under perfect competition, that would be the market wage, and that's the wage we would pay all the workers. But just like with a monopoly, remember we had to determine the output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and then we go up to demand curve to determine the price that is paid. It's not the same as under perfect competition. Well, it's the same in an imperfectly competitive labor market. We determine the number of what workers we will hire where the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the marginal factor cost of labor, and you go down to that point and determine the quantity of laborers that you'll hire, which is represented here by L. But then you will go up to the market labor supply curve because that shows you the number of workers, the wage that number of workers are willing to work for. And so then you go over horizontally from that point, and that determines the market wage, which will be below the marginal factor cost of labor. With a perfectly competitive labor market, that wage would be equal to the marginal factor cost of labor, but in an imperfectly competitive labor market, that wage will be below the marginal factor cost of labor. So one thing that we can see from this graph is that workers are being paid a wage that is less than the marginal revenue product of dollars that their efforts are bringing into the firm from what they are producing. But this should not be surprising, because here we're describing not a perfectly competitive labor market where there are so many employers that they can't affect the wage and they have to accept the market wage as a given and be wage takers. This may be the sole employer in the labor market. And if it is, it's a monopsonist, and this monopsony power allows them to pay lower wages than they would if the labor market were perfectly competitive. Here is an activity that we will do in class on thinking about the supply of labor. Here is a video from AC/DC Econ and Mr. Clifford that talks about perfectly competitive labor markets in the firm that you should watch. Here's an activity we'll do related to that on perfectly competitive labor markets. Here's an AC/DC Econ video by Mr. Clifford on the resource market, marginal revenue product, and marginal revenue cost. Here's an activity we'll do on resource markets, marginal revenue product, and marginal resource cost. Here's an activity we'll do on how a firm determines how many workers to hire. Here's a firm on an activity on graphing perfectly competitive labor markets that we will do. And here's one we'll do on imperfectly competitive labor markets, such as those faced by a monopsonist. And then here's a summary of the major learnings that we've had in this module. And this concludes our look at Module 71, the market for labor.